tutorial, I'm going to talk about how we can make a simple crashing effect of a vase in Houdini. So starting with the vase, obviously. So I'm using a vase that I got from a website called CG Traders. You can obviously use the same vase I'm using. The link is in the description, or you can use anything else. It's totally up to you. So now after we have our vase, what we're going to do is we're going to fracture it to make it look something like this. So let's break down our workflow. So our workflow is going to be like this. First, we're going to have our rig and then we're going to prepare it, like resizing it and whatnot. And once we have our rig, we're going to add the external material. So as you can see here, I've given a red material. The one in the link has a different color, but of course you can use either the same one given in the link or you can use your own material like I am. So now if we add our external material, what's left is now we fracture the rig. And after we fracture the rig, then we have our internal material, which means that once we fracture it, we'll have our interior parts, and we're going to have to give that a separate color, which will be around a grayish white sort of color. And once that's done, we're going to have to pack our geometry. We need to pack our geometry because the RBD simulation that we're going to do after requires packed objects which will have lesser primitives. So once we pack it, the only thing that's left is apply physics to it, which means we're going to simulate it. This is our entire workflow. It's pretty straightforward and simple. So now that we have our workflow, let's actually go ahead in Houdini and start doing it. So first, we're going to go to Houdini, and you want to make sure you save your file. And once you do that, you're going to add a geo container. So geo, and then you can rename it to vase. And once we go inside, we now need our base. So I'm going to add a file node and click on P for parameter. Now we can see that we need our geometry file. I have mine in my download, so all I'm going to do is get my file and drag and drop it. And now we have it. Okay, so now that we have our vase, you can notice that there are 4 of them. So now we just want any one of them. Of course, it's up to your liking. You can take any one of the vases that you like. I'm just going to go ahead with the first vase that we saw, which is this one over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to first add a blast node, which means that it deleted everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to give vase 1 and then delete not selected. So now we have our vase. Now that we have our vase, let's move it and resize it a bit, because you can see that this says -625, which means the vase is huge and it's definitely not at the center. So we can add a transform and give it to maybe 0.1. Yeah, there we go. And we can now see that it's much smaller. Now we can maybe change its translate in the X. Perfect. So now it's somewhere around the middle, and then maybe we can move it up a bit. Now we don't have to move it exactly. We don't have to move it exactly onto the ground because we're going to move it up anyways for it to crash. So it doesn't really matter, but you know, just in case. So yeah, maybe something like that. And now that we have that, we are now ready to go. And one thing you should know for sure is that you should not change the position of our pivot. You can see that there's a pivot transform here. You don't want to change that. If you change the pivot now, in the further steps that we do, there will be other mishaps. So do not change the position of the pivot. It's fine if the pivot is elsewhere. Do not change its position. So now we've prepared the rig, and when we go back to our presentation file, our next step is to add our material. So then what we're going to have to do is you either, like I said before, you can either use the material given in the link, or you could add your own material. And to do that, we're going to head over to the material context. Oh, what's this? So then we're going to add a principled shader. Excuse me. And we can now name this Vase, perhaps, and give it a sort of dark reddish color. And now we made our material, but we haven't applied it to our vase yet. So in order to apply it, we're gonna head over back to the OBJ context, and then we're going to add in a material. And when you use that, you can now go over to material, click on that, matte, and principled shader vase. And boom, we now have our material. Maybe I'll change its color to something a bit darker, not too red. Ah, perfect. Something like that. That looks good. So now we have prepared and we've added texture to our vase. So what's our next step? Our next step is fracturing the rig. Now before fracturing the vase in Houdini, I want to get over the three methods of fracturing that you can use in Houdini. And the most common one, the most common one used is the Voronoi Fracture, and the other fractures used are the Boolean and the RBD Material Fracture. So we'll go over them one by one. Starting with the Voronoi Fracture, the most commonly used fracturing method. The Voronoi Fracture, what it does is it uses points to do the fracturing. For example, let's say we have this grid over here, and we have 2 points, that one and that one. So what it's going to do is, using these 2 points, it's going to make a fracture like that. So the principle with the Voronoi Fracture is that whatever surface of the geometry that is closest to the point is going to be part of that piece. So you can see that we now have 2 pieces because 2 points. And this surface is close to this point. So that is now part of this point's piece. And if we were to add more points, our fracture would now become something like this. You can see that. And one important thing that you need to know is that each point that we use for the fracturing is not the centroid of the piece that is cut. So now that we have that down, that's the Voronoi Fracture. The thing with the Voronoi Fracture, or the disadvantage with the Voronoi Fracture, is that the cuts are too straight, giving it an unnatural sort of feel. So that's why the Voronoi Fracture is normally not preferred. So now that we have that covered, next is the Boolean. The Boolean, it fractures using another geometry. So that means it fractures one geometry using another geometry. The Voronoi Fracture used points for fracturing, but here we're using geometry. So now if we were to have a grid, and I made another grid, added some noise to it, and flipped it vertically, and used that as our cutting geometry, it would now make a sort of uneven, natural looking cut. But then again, there is also another disadvantage with the Boolean. And that disadvantage would be that you can see that there are lots of ins here and there, which means that Houdini is going to have a hard time calculating how each piece is going to react when we're simulating it. And so that's why we don't use Boolean either. In order to get the best of both the Voronoi Fracture and the Boolean, we use the RBD Material Fracture. And what the RBD Material Fracture does is it fractures based on the material type that we give. So it can be either concrete, glass, wood, etc. Depending on what we want it to fracture like, depending on the material type we give, it's going to fracture accordingly. So you can see that there are 3 outputs for the RBD Material Fracture. The first output is going to be the high-res output or geometry. The middle one, the pink colored one, is our constraints. And constraints are what hold our pieces together. And finally, we have our proxy geometry. The proxy geometry is actually what is getting solved in the dynamic operator, or when we're simulating, it's what's actually getting solved. To make this more clearer for you, we can now see that we've taken a peg, for example, and you can see that it has a lot of ends and all these concave stuff. So what we do is that we use a more simpler geometry, and in this case we use a box and we solve that one. So you can see that we solve the box like that. And what we do with the high res, or rather the pig, is that we make it act or react the same way the box reacted. So if you can see, it's going to react the same way our box reacted. So if I were to play that again, you can see that. So this means that we get the best of the Voronoi Fracture, which we use as proxy geometry, and the Boolean, which we use as high res. So that's the 3 types of fractures. So now when we head back to Houdini, we can now add in another geometry container. And we can name that perhaps simulation. And when we go into it, we can add an object merge. And we can go there and, oh, I totally forgot. So after we do our material, you can add in a null to show that we're done with this. Of course, adding a null isn't very necessary, but it's helpful in keep making things organized. So when we go back and click on the object merge, when you click on object 1, and boom, we have our null at the very top. So we can click on out, accept, and there you go. We now have our base. Now that we have our base, let's fracture it. So then we can add a RBD Material Fracture. This is going to take some time. And when we view it, if you can see closely, you will notice that there are fractures. Due to the color we've given, you won't be able to notice the little lines that are fractures. But if you want to see if Houdini fractured it or not, you can go ahead and add a RBD exploded view. Then you view that, there you go. So this white wireframe-ish thing that you can see is actually our proxy geometry. And if you don't want to see your proxy geometry, you can just uncheck show proxy geometry. So now it's going to show us our high-res geometry. Now you can see that we fractured it, but it looks exactly like how our Voronoi would do it. They're all straight cuts. And the RBD Material Fracture does make it. So now that we have our fractures, So now what we can do is add a little bit of unnatural sort of feel to our high-res geometry. So in order to do that, you can go to the RBD Material Fracture, and first you can go to the chipping tab, and then you can go ahead and click Enable Chipping. And soon enough, just a couple of seconds. Yep. We will have now chipped geometry. So you can see that what the chipping does is that it makes these little cuts at the corner of our vase to give it that sort of, to make those little tiny particles that come out. So of course this will be included in the proxy geometry. So now that we have our chipping done, if you want to give a more of an unnatural sort of look, you can go over here to Detail and click on Edge Detail and Interior Detail. I'm not doing that for now, but you can do it of course. So now that we have our geometry, we now can notice that the interior is now red, and that's not red. It has to be this sort of porcelainish color. So to give it that porcelain color, first we're going to go back to our material network and add another principled shader. Call this Inside, and give it a sort of dark grayish color. And then now when we come back, like we did before, take our high-res geometry and give a material. And then we can go ahead and principled shader inside. But then you can now see that not just the interior part, but the entire thing is white. And we don't want that. We just want the interior. But then why is this happening? Well, the thing is, we don't specify that we need it to be the interior portion only. But then how can we specify? Well, the answer to that is in the RBD Material Fracture. If you go to the Geo spreadsheet and in the primitive groups, you can see that there is a group called Inside that is created. And this comes in handy for us. So now all that we have to do is click on that, and you already have your inside down here. You click on that, and there you go. You have your interior only that is colored. And perhaps maybe we can change maybe its roughness a bit more. And we don't want reflectivity either. Perfect. Now go back to OBJ. Okay, so now that we have that down, what we're gonna do next is, you can now see that we fractured the rig and we added our internal material. So our next step is to pack it. So now in order to pack it, we're going to go ahead and add an RBD configure. And then we're going to connect these two and that. And now when you view it, our material, you won't be able to see the material, which is completely normal. Since we're packing it, it's going to take away the material, but don't worry. That is completely normal. So then, we don't know if it's packed or not. It looks the same, right? But to know if it's packed, you can go to info and you can see that now the points are only 219. But if you go to the RBD Material Fracture, there are 19,000 points, primitives are 15,000, and much more. So then, how does the RBD configure pack our geometry? Well, it does the packing based on an attribute that called name, which is made in the RBD Material Fracture. So now that I've selected RBD Material Fracture, if we go to the Geo spreadsheet and in the primitive group, if we scroll here, we can now see name. So you can see that in all of the primitives there are, all of them have same name attributes. These one have 127. These bunch of them have 128. And so what the RBD configure does is that it makes the name attribute into a point attribute, and each point has a unique name, meaning that none of them have the same name attribute. You can see 0, 1, 2, 3, and then here it's 1, 4, 4, 0. So that's how we do the packing. And now once we've packed it, we come to our final step, which is applying physics. But wait, before we do any physics, we still haven't moved our geometry upwards. There's no point in simulating it if we don't move it up to make it drop down. So then, first we're going to have to pack these three outputs into one. Why? Because if we add in a transform, you can see that it has only one input, and the RBD configure gives three outputs. So what we want to do is we're going to add an RBD pack node, and once we add that, it converts the three into one output, the three input into one output. So now if we were to give transform, we can now move it up to perhaps 5? No, not. Maybe you could move it to around 20. We're getting somewhere. Or maybe 40? That's much better. And if you want, you could also give it a slight rotation to the side. So now it has that sort of slanting and falling effect. And so now that we've moved our vase up, so now we're going to apply physics. We're going to have to simulate it. So what we have to do is we're going to have to convert this one input back into 3. So to do that, we're going to have to give an RBD unpack node. And when we give the unpack, you can now see that we have all 3 again. So now that we have that, let's go and do our simulation. To do our simulation, all we have to do is add in a RBD bullet solver. So add that and connect all of them. And then we're going to view it. And now we have our simulation. And you can see our constraints in there. And now what you're going to do is we need this vase to collide with something when it falls. So what we're going to do is go to collision, and then we're going to give the ground type to ground plane. So as you can see, that's going to add in a ground plane for us. Now it looks like it's only that portion, but it's actually infinite. That's the ground. So now if we were to play this, it's going to crash to the ground and it's going to break like we wanted it to. And now the final step is we could file cache it before you played it so that we would play it from our disk. So you can change that to whatever you would like, vase. And the frame range is okay, that's fine. And then you can click on, we're going to have to give it a load from disk. And you have to click save to disk. It's going to render for some time. And then you will have a simple crashing effect of the vase. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you learned something from this video. See ya!